I saw this article recently, and the article was about how Americans are ignorant of China. But not just regular ignorant, willfully ignorant. And it made a really interesting case. So I wanted to read the article to you and see what you think. Information flows abundantly and freely eastward. Little returns west. Chinese investors, students, government officials, and corporations have mapped every inch of America. The same cannot be said for Americans. It's a very strong statement to begin with. Let's see where it goes. But this situation is not actually due to protectionism by the Chinese state. Rather, Americans have voluntarily chosen isolation. The flood of Chinese students to the U.S. has accelerated at a blinding pace, with a nearly 650% increase between 1999 and 2017. From 2015 to 2016, China sent over 328,000 students to America, while the U.S. sent roughly 11,000 to China. America sent around the same number of students to Ireland, whose economy is less than 3% the size of China. That is abundantly true. All you got to do is walk around LA, and there's 1 million Chinese students there. Not just in America, they're sending students to Australia and England, everywhere. Yet, how many American students at universities do you see here? Not very many. But why? And you're going to say, oh, because of the language and visas and all of that. Well, that goes into it next. Check this out. America has cemented a generation that is ill-prepared to effectively collaborate, compete, and respond to China's rise. An estimated 300 to 400 million Chinese students, or about 25%, are studying English. Actually, it's a required course. All students study English. It's part of the Gaokao, their college entry exam. You have to study English. They start teaching English in 3rd grade.
Confidence is the most challenging personal experience.
While there are only about 200,000 U.S. students, or roughly 0.06%, that are currently studying some form of Chinese. It's not even offered. I mean, in California schools, they offer what? Spanish, obviously, which makes sense. And then they also offer French. Do they offer Chinese? Nope. That's a big shame. While trade balances and import tariffs might be highly controversial and fiercely contested, this intellectual imbalance has no significant opposition within the U.S. China's door is open, but few Americans will venture through. You know, I agree. I mean, yeah, you have to get a visa to come here, but it's not difficult to get a student visa and come study here. This is where it gets a little controversial. Popular U.S. media perpetuates constant negative narratives about China. Ghost cities, real estate bubbles, pollution, corruption. While many of these problems are real, the predominantly negative coverage drowns out the positive elements of life in China and its abundant economic opportunities. In doing so, the media dissuades Americans' rising students, as well as business and political leaders, from learning more about the country. I can't agree with that more. I mean, have you ever seen a positive news story about China on Fox News? I haven't. They just talk about it. I mean, look at the economic advisor for Trump, Peter Navarro. I mean, he's a professor from my hometown, but he's the guy who wrote Death by China and produced that movie. It's so hyperbolic about the relationship between East and West. It's devastating, and he's the one who's advising Trump on these trade tariffs and this trade war that's going on. Chinese elites and netizens, on the other hand, carefully observe American political, social, and technological and pulp culture developments. Mark Zuckerberg's Senate hearings, the SpaceX Falcon Heavy rocket launch, and President Trump's stance on the NFL national anthem protests, for example, were all closely followed on Chinese social media. Local discussions on American internal affairs are buoyed by an overwhelming number of Chinese people who have studied abroad and returned home living in the country. Yes, the interest in American culture and the knowledge of American culture by high school students, college students, business people is remarkably good compared to even my knowledge of Chinese culture and Chinese politics. And I've lived here for almost 3 years. One would assume that Silicon Valley, flush with a large Chinese expat community and a relatively agile business models, would be the best equipped to adapt to the requirements of the Chinese market. And not so. In recent conversation A top American venture capitalist underestimated the number of employees Tencent had by a factor of 10. Everyone hears how big things are here in China, and until you actually see it, you have really no idea what you're talking about. Actually, if you even realize how much of an opportunity it is and the growth potential of the market here, nobody really understands or knows how to penetrate it, how to get involved. That lack of intellectual capital is the largest barrier of entry for businesses here. Contrary to the common belief and narrative that China is proactively hyper-protectionist and unwelcoming to foreign companies, the history of the American consumer tech penetration in China is strewn with unforced errors. But these disputes obscure the embarrassing reality. America has voluntarily ceded its intellectual arbitrage to China by opening the US up for total download without even attempting to return the favor. I think this is probably the most controversial one, because in America they say, oh, they've stolen our jobs, they've stolen our factory and our intellectual capacity, and there is some truth to that, I'm not going to lie. But at the same time, it's only going one way, it's not going both ways. So here's some examples of that. While pioneering the concept of customer-to-customer marketplaces in China in the early 2000s, eBay faced no major regulatory hurdles, yet the company ceded its market leadership to Alibaba's equivalent product, Taobao, because eBay failed to recognize and adapt to the requirements of the Chinese customer. Among multiple foreseeable blunders were eBay's decision to advertise online rather than television, where the vast majority of its target customers were, favor auctions rather than direct sales, which its customers preferred, and not to personalize listings for Chinese tastes, instead keeping with US sections in place. In 2003, eBay held over a 70% market share in China, yet by 2008, Taobao held over 80% of the same market. So is that Chinese company stealing, or is that just an American company not understanding the target market here? And the list goes on. Groupon, which hired foreign managers to lead the local Chinese teams and refused to reduce its take rates to match with competitors, flamed out in China. Uber banded its registrations to email addresses that are rarely used in China, rather than WeChat or mobile numbers. Airbnb took 3 years to find a local leader and finally settled on an unfortunate choice who boasted a Silicon Valley pedigree, who was unable to manage local teams and grapple with Beijing on regulatory issues. The company also selected a misguided translation of its name in Mandarin. I wonder what that is. What is the translation? I don't know. Airbnb translated in Mandarin? I don't know. These are all preventable errors, but ones driven by simple arrogance of a one-size-fits-all approach and a lack of knowledge about the local market. That is very true. One of the things I see mostly is everyone talking about the real estate bubble here. They say, okay, showing signs, if we apply these numbers to what happened in America in 2008, 2009, then the real estate bubble here will be the worst in history. But you can't do that, because the regulatory environment here is different. The laws of ownership, it's not even an ownership, it's more like a lease. The government really owns everything. The way capital works here, and liquidity measures, and the cost of loans and stuff is so much different. The Chinese government is rich, and they're going to take care of the market. It's funny, because if you see all these houses, there's tons of empty houses here, and every empty house that's not lived in but owned as an investment is a shell. It's just a concrete shell. There's no flooring, no ceiling, no decoration whatsoever. In fact, if you buy it and decorate it and put tiles and a kitchen in there, it's actually worth less than an empty shell. That's an example of the difference in the markets that most people don't understand, because a new buyer will have to come in and demo all that, and that's additional cost. So try understanding that in a Western real estate market where new decorations and upgraded appliances and everything actually increase the value. This next part, I think, is very true. The speed and scale of China's rise has caught the U.S. academic, political, and business communities off guard. Yes, I remember China saying, oh, we're going to build the world's largest port, we're going to build, the world's largest this, and we're going to dump a ton of money, billions and billions of dollars into this venture, and everyone said, this is crazy. The ambitions are so big, there's no way the Chinese people can do it, and so far they've proven everybody wrong. The first step to address these problems is to ensure American students are more deeply embedded in Chinese language, culture, history, and more importantly, economics. It does concede that China is by no means a user-friendly gateway to the U.S. students, but American educational institutions have thrown up the barriers of their own, providing few Mandarin courses for true novices, imposing high language proficiency requirements for students wishing to study abroad in China, and limited student internship opportunities with Chinese firms. Now, it is getting better. You do see more, especially in the tech industry. Shenzhen is really leading the way. You see a lot of internships. Americans aren't just competing with other Americans, they're competing with the whole world for those internships. The U.S. academic community should tear down these walls and orient the education system to be more open to Chinese language and historical studies. Such shifts are not impossible. In the 4 years following 9/11, American students' enrollment in Arabic language courses grew by 126%. Why do we respond to negative incentives but not positive ones? Is not the opportunity of the Chinese market enough to entice future American students and politicians to favor Mandarin courses over French or Italian ones? Would not a year abroad in Beijing or Shanghai be a far more enriching for a student's job prospects than time spent in Rome, Sevilla, or Sydney? It is unclear what manner of wake-up call will jolt Americans into action. Perhaps it'll be the day that China passes the U.S. in the world's largest economy, but by then it will be too late. Very interesting point of view, and I don't disagree with very much of it at all. In fact, I agree with a lot of it. But I've given you my thoughts. What do you think? Comment below, let me know, I'm curious.